Hello, Biology 130 students, and welcome to the first slideshow and the first lecture in our series of lectures. I'm hoping that this lecture will just be an introduction to the course and an introduction to the field of anatomy and physiology, or the fields of anatomy and physiology. And it will be in two parts. We'll take a break in the middle and then ask a few review questions. Now, this material in the introductory chapter, most of it can be found in chapter 1 of your OpenStax Anatomy and Physiology book. This material is not from the coloring book. The coloring book is mainly for use in the laboratory, but I will ask you some questions on the main exams from the coloring book as well. Okay, so let's have an introduction to anatomy and physiology and an introduction to the human body. So what I'm going to talk about in this lecture is I'm going to start by talking about how living things are organized, from the smallest, the various levels of organization of the body, starting from the smallest things, which are molecules. Molecules are organized together. Eventually, if you put a lot of molecules together, you have very large molecules, which are called macromolecules. And eventually, if you put together macromolecules into various structures, you end up getting cells. Then if you put together a whole bunch of cells that have the same structure and function, you have a tissue. And the study of tissues, the study of skin versus kidney cells versus brain cells, neural tissue, that is referred to as histology. I will probably mention this several times during the course, but the word logi is a Latin word meaning to study. That's where the word logic comes from. And the word histo is a word that simply means tissues. It's an ancient Greek word meaning tissues. All right, now if you put together a whole bunch of tissues into a structure that carries out one particular function in the body, we call that an organ. And then if you put together all the organs that are responsible for the same function in the body, for instance, all the organs that are responsible for breathing, all the organs that are responsible for urination, all the organs that are responsible for digestion. If you put together all of the organs into categories based on what function they perform, based on what they do, we call that an organ system. And it has become common practice over the last 100 years or so for anatomy students and physiology students and medical students to study biology, to study anatomy and physiology and medicine according to systems biology. So systems biology simply means learning about the human body by studying the organ systems one at a time. 200 years ago, it was commonplace that physicians, doctors, and surgeons would just haphazardly learn the names of every part of the body, and they would learn the symptoms of certain sicknesses, and they would learn what you had to do in order to cure those sicknesses. But there was no rationale to it. There was no system to how they learned. They just had to learn a lot of facts that were seemingly unrelated at first. But we found out eventually that you can learn about the human body much better and much more easily if you learn about the systems, the organ systems. So if we study the organ systems one at a time, this is kind of an artificial categorization that humans have put on the human body, but nevertheless, if you study the systems one at a time, it becomes much easier to understand what the human body is doing. All right, then I will discuss the difference between anatomy and physiology, but just to let you know, anatomy is the study of all of the human body parts, all of the parts of the human body, what are they all named and where are they all located. And then physiology is the study of how all of these anatomical features and how all of these organs and structures work together to keep the body alive. And so I can tell you the names of the kidneys and the ureters and the urinary bladder and the urethra, which are all considered to be part of the renal system. But that doesn't tell you anything about how the renal system works per se. But if I tell you how if I tell you the various salt concentrations that are present in different parts of the kidneys, and I tell you how those salt concentrations work to extract water out of the urine in order to keep the water and let the urine flow out, that would all be in the purview of physiology, not anatomy. Right? So anatomy is basically anatomy is kind of like geography for the human body. You learn the names of all the places, but that doesn't really tell you much about the people who live there. Whereas history or cultural geography would tell you all about how these different political systems and different people living in different parts of the world. So that's anatomy versus physiology. Then we're going to discuss something called homeostasis. And as it turns out, one of the branches of physiology is homeostasis. So homeostasis is a branch of physiology, and homeostasis is the process by which the human body keeps certain things within confined to certain levels. For example, human body temperature is controlled through various mechanisms to be around 37 degrees Celsius. If the human body temperature goes up too high, that is referred to as feedback. In fact, that's referred to as negative feedback, because the human body temperature is meant to be held at 37. That's the functioning that the organs in the body work best at 37 degrees. And so if we keep the body temperature at 37, everything is fine. If the temperature goes too high or too low, we usually do something to bring it back into the normal range. And so those things that we do to bring it back into the normal range is called homeostasis. The word stasis means to stand in the same place, And then homeo means everything. So homeostasis literally means to make sure everything stays in the same place, to make sure all of the parameters of the body temperature, the amount of sugar in the blood, the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, the amount of oxygen in the blood, all of these things are meant to stay within a certain range. And the process of keeping them all within a certain range is referred to as homeostasis. So as I said, if body temperature is meant to be 37 degrees and something happens to raise it, we will do something to lower it again. The thing that we do to lower it again is we sweat. Sweat is where you put liquid on the outside of the skin. The liquid evaporates. Those of you that have studied chemistry know that evaporation, when you evaporate something, usually the temperature in the liquid is raised by kind of stealing temperature from the things around it. So when something vaporizes, the things around it will become cooler. So when the liquid, the sweat that we put onto the surface of our skin evaporates, that will actually have the effect of cooling the skin, and we lower the body temperature back to its normal range, 37. If the body temperature drops below that, what do we do to warm up? What do we do to warm up again? We shiver. So the brain sends out signals to make the muscles contract and relax in rapid succession, so that this has the effect of generating a lot of heat, and so that brings the body temperature back up to 37. So the act of sweating and the act of shivering are two things that are meant to keep the body temperature controlled through homeostasis. Okay, and then we're going to move on to part 2 of the lecture. We'll stop the lecture there and take a break. And then we'll move on to part 2 of the lecture, which is we will learn about anatomical terminology and anatomical position. Anatomical terminology is just a language that people who study anatomy use to explain where different parts of the body are relative to other parts of the body, right? So if one body part is above another body part, if you're an anatomist, you would say that body part is superior. The body part one body part is located above another, we say that it is superior to that body part. If body part B is located below body part A, we say B is inferior to A. There are various other terms that we use to say whether something is to the side or closer to the center than another body part. We call that lateral or proximal. Lateral or medial, rather. And we will discuss the meaning of all those anatomical terms. The sooner you learn those anatomical terms, the easier the studying will be, because from now on, we basically call everything by its anatomical position. And then, just for fun, at the end of the lecture, we will examine some medical root words. Anatomy and physiology and medicine were created as sciences. They were created during a period where all scholars knew how to speak Greek and Latin. There was a period in the Middle Ages and on mainly through the Renaissance, where all intellectuals, all scholars, all all educated people had to know how to speak the same language, even though some of them were speaking Italian, some of them speaking French, some of them speaking English, some of them speaking German. But supposedly all of those scholars in Europe could all speak to each other in Latin because they were all supposed to have learned Latin. And in Greek in some cases. So generally a science has a lot of words in it. Every science has its own language, every science has its own jargon, its own professional jargon. And anatomy and physiology, the jargon that was incorporated into it is a reflection of the age when it became a science. For example, computer science is a science that was invented in the 20th century, and it was invented mainly by Americans. And so you find a lot of American slang in computer science, like rebooting and looping and things like that. Those are all kind of American slang words. Chemistry was kind of had its zenith in the 19th century, and it was invented by a lot of the important chemists were Germans. And so that's why if you look in chemistry, a lot of the words that are incorporated into chemistry are German words, like the Aufbau principle, for instance, for electrons. And biology as a science, as well as anatomy, physiology, and medicine, all of these things reached their zenith as a science during the Renaissance, when all of the intellectuals were supposed to be speaking Latin and Greek to each other. So most of these funny sounding words that we have in anatomy and physiology are derived from Greek words or Latin words. And so we'll go through some of these words and see how you put together these ancient Greek and Latin words and you make medical terms that we use even today. So we'll discuss that in the second lecture. Okay, so today this is all we're going to discuss. We'll just discuss these things. All right, so the word biology is a combination of two ancient words. Bio is an ancient Greek word meaning life, and logi is a Latin word meaning the study of. So biology literally translates into the study of life. And that's a little bit ironic because if you look in the biology lab, most things that are in there are dead. So we're actually cutting things up and looking at them when we're dead, and we're doing that in order to learn how things work when they were alive. But anyway, that's where the word biology comes from. All right, now all living things start at the smallest. If we cut everything that's alive up into the smallest possible fragments, we have an atom. Right? And then that's a little bit incorrect, because an atom can then be cut up into neutrons, electrons, and protons. And then if you're studying physics, you know that neutrons, electrons, and protons are even divided up into smaller things, but we don't have to worry about that in biology. In fact, in biology, we barely have to worry about chemistry. We just have to learn the minimum amount of chemistry to be biologists. So that's lucky for us. Unfortunately, in this course, I am required to teach you a certain amount of elementary chemistry as well. So in the next lecture, I apologize, but I have to teach you a little bit of chemistry. So that'll be in the second series of lectures. All right, now an element is if you have something that is made up of only one type of atom. It's composed of only one type of atom. So for instance, gold, pure gold, is made up entirely of gold atoms. And gold atoms have a characteristic number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. In fact, the way that you make different atoms is by putting together different numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and then you have an atom. If you have all the same atom, that's called an element. Right? And then if you take atoms from different elements and then you react them together using chemical reactions, you can release energy or consume energy, and you can form chemical bonds or you can break chemical bonds, and you can put them back together into different orders. And if you put together two or more different atoms, you've created something called a molecule. All right, so here is kind of a pyramid that represents the structures of life. The smallest units that life is made of is atoms. If you put together different types of atoms, you have molecules. If you put together many different molecules, you have something called macromolecules. The word macro is an ancient Greek word meaning large or very large. And so we are going to learn about the macromolecules that make up human life and other forms of life. And then if you put together enough macromolecules, you put them together into some kind of an order, and you can build a living unit that is referred to as a cell. Right? So a cell is the smallest unit of life. Technically, if you're studying anything that's bigger than a cell, you're a biologist. If you're studying anything that's smaller than a cell, you're a biochemist. If you're studying macromolecules instead of cells, then you're a biochemist by definition. If you study, if you want to study life and you want to be a biologist, and anatomy and physiology are included in the study of biology, then you're studying things that are the size of a cell or larger. Now, if you put together a whole bunch of cells that all look the same and are doing the same thing and are carrying out the same function, then you have something called a tissue. And the study of tissues is called histology, histology. And then if you put together a whole bunch of tissues into a functional organ that carries out some function for the body, that is an organ. And then if you put together all of the organs that carry out or which are involved in the same function, then you have an organ system. And we are going to study the human body according to organ systems, right? So if you put together all the organs that carry out the same function, you have an organ system, and all of those organ systems work together to sustain life, right? So we will study all of these things. All right, as I said, if you put together two or more different atoms, you have a molecule. Many molecules are small, but if you put together, hundreds and hundreds of different atoms, you can create some very large molecules, and very large molecules are referred to as macromolecules, macromolecules. And as it happens, the biologists have classified all of the macromolecules that the human body is made of into one of four categories. And those four categories are proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. Okay, so macromolecules are large molecules. If you take smaller molecules and polymerize them together, you attach them all together, you can make larger macromolecules. They're actually made according to a modular scheme, a modular system, so that if you're building electronic devices, you have different resistors, right? The resistors are kind of like the macromolecules. If you put the resistors and the capacitors together in the right order, you've built a radio. If you put them together in a different order, you've built a computer. So all of these things are examples of putting together different monomers to make larger things. So in biology, we have these four classes of macromolecules: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. If you put them together, if you put these smaller things together in a particular order, you can make larger macromolecules, which is what we use to make more complicated things like cells. Okay, now, what are the monomers that we put together to make these things? Okay, well, proteins are made of smaller monomers, smaller units that are referred to as amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acids, and you can put them together in whatever order you want, and by putting them together in different numbers and in different orders, you will have created different proteins. Right? And examples of proteins are muscle tissue, for instance, right? So when you look at your muscles, those are made mostly of a protein called myosin. There's a few other proteins in there as well, but proteins, muscle tissue is an example of a protein. There are a few other things. You might have heard of enzymes. Enzymes are small proteins that catalyze chemical reactions. They carry out chemical reactions. Enzymes are proteins that facilitate chemical reactions. Excuse me. All right, the carbohydrates are commonly referred to as the sugars. That's a bit of a misnomer. A misnomer is a word that's badly chosen because it doesn't really convey the meaning it's supposed to. That's what a misnomer is. And so the carbohydrates are sometimes called sugars, but that's a little deceptive because sugars are sweet to the taste, whereas most of the carbohydrates that make up the human body and which make up other living things are not sweet at all. So one example of a carbohydrate is glucose. Glucose is a monomer that you can put together and into different polymers, and we'll talk about them later. Lipids are made of hydrocarbons, and they tend to be hydrophobic. We'll talk about this later, but the word hydrophobic means they do not like to dissolve in water. So, for example, olive oil is an example of a lipid, right? A lipid, and so is fat. Lard or butter, those two things are classified as fats, and fats are classified as lipids. So lipids means fats and oils, and neither fats nor oils like to be dissolved in water. They tend not to dissolve in water. So you mix oil and water when you make salad dressing. You know very well that if you want to put it on your salad, you have to shake up the bottle. You have to shake up the bottle to temporarily mix the oil and the water. In fact, the oil and the water never mix. What happens is that the oil becomes emulsified, what's called emulsified. So the water breaks the oil up into little tiny beads, into little tiny droplets, but those droplets will never dissolve in the water because they are hydrophobic. All right, the nucleic acids are what we make DNA and RNA out of, right? So basically what they're made out of is you take a carbohydrate, namely ribose, and then you add something called a nitrogenous base to it, and then you create something called a nucleotide. If you put together a number of these nucleotides, you can make a gene. So genes are made of DNA. DNA is an example of a nucleic acid. And by the way, genes code for proteins. Genes do not code for carbohydrates or lipids or nucleic acids. Genes code for proteins. Genes create proteins, but no other type of macromolecule. So if genes code for proteins, then how do we make carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids? Well, the example is we make those things through chemical reactions that take place in the human body, take place in every cell, and those chemical reactions that take place are mediated by enzymes, which are also proteins. Right? So the proteins essentially, what that means is that the proteins essentially build the other three types of macromolecules. Now, on to cell biology. Cell biology, we'll discuss that a little bit. Basically, you have a cell, which is the smallest unit of life. So here we have a diagram of a cell. A cell is, it usually contains nucleic acids, which are located in a nucleus. Right, so here's the central part, the nucleus of the cell, and you will find the genes, which are made out of DNA, in that nucleus. The genes are converted into something called messenger RNA, which then goes out into the outside the nucleus into what's known as the cytoplasm, and those genes are converted into protein by little tiny things called organelles. Right? And by the way, you know that the human body has organs. The human body is composed of organs, so you have a heart, a liver, a kidneys, and so on. Well, cells have little functional units too, but because they're very small, we don't call them organs, we call them organelles. Right? So an organelle is an organ that does a specific job inside a cell. So example, ribosomes are an example of organelles. Right? They're one type of organelle. There's another type of organelle here called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum contains a bunch of ribosomes, and the purpose of the rough endoplasmic reticulum is to build proteins that are meant for export. They're meant to be exported outside of the cell. The Golgi complex is another organelle. This is the Golgi complex, or this is a diagram of the Golgi complex over here. And the purpose of the Golgi complex is to put sugars onto proteins that are meant to be sent outside the cell. So you put carbohydrates onto proteins. That is a function called glycosylation, which we'll talk about later. And glycosylation means to put carbohydrates onto proteins, and that is something that the Golgi complex does. The energy for all of these chemical reactions is generated inside an organelle called a mitochondrion, singular mitochondrion, plural mitochondria, right? And there's a mitochondrion right there. Right? So these things are all classified as organelles. Typically, the size of a cell is approximately 10 microns or micrometers. So cell biologists measure the sizes of cells in microns or micrometers. A typical cell is around 10 micrometers, and so you might say, well, then how big is a mitochondria? A mitochondrion is typically 1 micron. The nucleus is about 1 or 2 microns in diameter. The entire cell is maybe 10 microns in diameter. So the word micron is an abbreviation for micrometer. And how big is a micrometer? Right, so if you take a meter and you divide it by 100, what units do you have? And the answer, of course, is you have centimeters. But what if you take a meter and you divide it by 1,000? What unit do you have? You have millimeters. Okay, finally, if you take a meter and you divide it by 1,000,000, what do you have? You have a micrometer or a micron, right? So a micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, which is fairly small. You can't see it without a microscope. Okay, so by the way, the difference between a biologist and a microbiologist is that a microbiologist studies entire forms of life that are so small that you need a microscope to see them, whereas other biologists are studying life forms that are bigger than that, and you don't need a microscope to see them. So the need to use a microscope is generally the dividing line between biologists and microbiologists. Okay, here you can see some cells. We're looking at them under a microscope, right? And here's a hollow part. These cells are organized around a hollow part, which forms something called a duct, D-U-C-T, duct. Duct means a little tiny tube that, in this case, is producing hormones and sending them out to the body, but we'll talk about that later. And so by the time you're finished with the second or third lecture, you will actually be able to tell me what type of tissue this is just by looking at it. So we'll get to that. That will be when we discuss histology. Okay, so histology, of course, is the study of tissues, and we have several different types of tissues that we classify. So I just mentioned the fact that the macromolecules in the body are divided up into 4 different classes or 4 different categories. Can you remember what they are? And if you can't remember what they are the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids. Those are the 4 types of macromolecules that the body is made up of. And then if you take all of the cells that have a similar shape and a similar function, the study of shape, by the way, is called morphology. Morphology, again, means to study. And then morph means shape. Right, so histology is the study of shape. Histology is the study of tissues. Morphology is the study of shape. You study the shape of bacteria to be able to identify different bacteria. You study the shape of cells, the shape and the appearance of cells, to tell me what type of tissue they're made of. Okay, so histology. In histology, we classify all of the tissues in the human body according to one of 4 classes. Right? Epithelium, or epithelial tissue, that's generally the tissue that's on the outside of things. Muscle tissue, you know what muscle tissue is. Nervous tissue, the brain, for instance, is made of nervous tissue. And finally, connective tissue. Connective tissue is everything that's not epithelium, muscle, or nervous tissue. Right? Now, this is a little bit of a cheating thing. This is a little bit of a cheat, because if you say everything that's not epithelium, muscle, or nervous tissue is connective tissue, that actually encompasses quite a few things. And so connective tissue is further subdivided into 6 subcategories. Blood is considered to be connective tissue. Bone is considered to be connective tissue. Adipose tissue, which is commonly known as fat storage tissue, is also classified as connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. You have cartilage inside your ear and inside of your nose, for instance. And then we have 2 other types of connective tissue. One type is called loose connective tissue, and another type is called fibrous connective tissue. And we will discuss what all of those things are. All right, so epithelium lines the outer surfaces and inner compartments of the body, like the skin is classified as epithelial tissue. The tissue that lines the inside of the stomach is also classified as epithelial tissue. The tissue that lines the inside of the intestine is classified as epithelial tissue as well. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. Striated muscle is also known as skeletal muscle. That's the muscle that we use to control our body movements. So when you lift up your arm, you're using several different muscles. All of those muscles are classified as being skeletal muscle or striated muscle. Okay, the next type of muscle that you find in the body is called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle generally lines the outside of organs and helps things to move through the organs. For example, the outside of the bladder is lined with smooth muscle, so that when we urinate, the smooth muscle outside the bladder will squeeze the bladder to squeeze the urine out. The blood vessels, the veins and the arteries are surrounded by smooth muscle on the outside as well. And the purpose of that is to either make the diameter of the blood vessels increase or decrease. Right? So when the smooth muscle that's surrounding a blood vessel relaxes, the blood vessel diameter increases. That's called vasodilation. We'll talk about that later. And when the smooth muscles contract, they will cause the diameter of the blood vessel to get smaller. That's called vasoconstriction, and we'll talk about that later as well. All right, so we have striated or skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. The third type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle, which you find only in the heart. And like the other two types of muscle, cardiac muscle has unique features and a unique function. Okay, nervous tissue refers to the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves, basically. The main type of cell that defines nervous tissue is a type of cell called a neuron, right? So you will find many neurons in nervous tissue. And then in addition to neurons, we also find a type of cell called a glial cell. The glial cell is there to support the neuron. Right, so glial cells carry out functions that support the functions of neurons, but the neurons are actually the main functional type of cell that you find in nervous tissue. And then we have the connective tissue. There are 6 types of connective tissue, including blood, bone, cartilage, adipose tissue, as well as loose fibrous tissue and fibrous connective tissue. All right, so once again, epithelial tissue you would find on the outside of the body. The skin is an example of epithelial tissue, but you would find epithelial tissue lining the inside of the stomach. Epi means, the word epi, E-P-I, means on top of or above everything else. Now, if you have a hollow compartment inside the body, the tissue that's lining that hollow compartment is considered to be the top of, that's considered to be the top before you have a bunch of different layers of tissue, and then the top layer of tissue borders on the hollow space, right? It borders on the hollow space, and so we would refer to that as epithelium as well. Right, so the tissue that lines the outside of the body is classified as epithelium, as well as the tissue that lines any of the hollow compartments. The tissue that lines the inside of the stomach is epithelium. The tissue that lines the inside of the lungs is epithelium as well. Okay, and then nervous tissue, that's the tissue that makes up the brain, the spinal column, and the nerves. And then we have connective tissue, and there's several different types of connective tissue. We have the blood, which is flowing through the cardiovascular system. Bone is considered to be connective tissue as well. Adipose tissue is fat storage cells. We all have a bit of fat here and there, a lot more than we realize, in fact, because it's inside the body as well as near the surface. But adipose tissue is fat storage tissue, is also classified as a connective tissue. Cartilage is firm but somewhat strong, but also flexible. So we have cartilage in our ears and in our nose. That's why you can bend your ear, but you can't bend your arm except at the elbow. So you can't bend bones without breaking them. Cartilage is meant to be strong, not as strong as bone, obviously, but quite a bit more flexible than bone. So it's meant to be strong but flexible. Okay, so bone is a connective tissue, cartilage is a connective tissue, adipose tissue is a connective tissue, and so is loose and fibrous connective tissue. So those 4 categories, epithelial, muscle, nervous tissue, and connective tissue, are the 4 basic types of connective tissue, the 4 basic types of tissue that form the human body. All right, so the organ systems, an organ is a structure made of specialized tissue that has a certain job. So the heart is an organ, the kidneys are organs, right? If you put together all of the organs that carry out the same general function in the body, we call that an organ system. Right? And we learn biology, physiology, anatomy, and medicine by studying the systems one at a time, as opposed to just trying to study the names, as opposed to just trying to learn the names of a bunch of body parts with nothing connecting one to another. Humans find it much more easy to learn things if you can say what it's connected to. What is this organ related to? What are the other organs that do the same thing? The human brain is a marvelous thing. We like to think that the reason why humans have such big brains is to allow us to be logical, but in fact that's not quite true. The psychologists tell us that the actual purpose of the big brain is to understand relationships between people and relationships between things, to make sense of the world by spotting and understanding relationships between things. So if we study how all these organs are related, some of them are more closely related to this organ than others, we study how they're all related, it's much easier for us to learn what they all are that way by saying, who's in the same family with this organ, who has a relationship with that organ, right? So all of these studying systems biology is a very convenient way to simply study the function of all the organs and then therefore learn where they all are and what they all do. Okay, so we're going to learn several different organ systems in this course, and the different organ systems that we're going to learn one at a time are listed on the right-hand side of this slide. Let me just briefly go through all of them for you. Okay, so the integument or the integumentary system refers to the skin. Right? So the integument or the integumentary system refers to the skin. The skin, that also includes the hair and the fingernails and the toenails. So the skin, the hair, and the nails are all considered to be part of the integument or the integumentary system. That's the integument. We'll study that first. Okay, the skeletal system includes the bones that give the body shape and structure and strength. Right? That is called the skeletal system. The muscular system is the muscles that are attached to the bones. Now you know that we have cardiac muscle and we have smooth muscle, but by far the most abundant type of muscle that you find in the body are the skeletal muscles, or the also known as striated muscles. So here we have skeletal muscles that are actually attached to the bones, and their purpose is to allow us to move the bones, right? So whenever you move your arm up and down, you bend your elbow, you bend your knee, all of that is a result of the skeletal muscles pulling on one bone or the other. And not to scare you, but we're going to learn the names of quite a lot of these bones. We're going to learn the names of a lot of these bones, and we're going to learn the names of a lot of these muscles. We're going to learn the names of all of the important bones, hundreds of them, and we're going to learn the names of all of the muscles, dozens and dozens of them. The nervous system tells the muscles what to do, as well as the organ systems that are lined with smooth muscle and so on. So we have the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system are very closely related. The nervous system is generally divided into two divisions. One is called the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, is the nerves that come out of the spinal cord and control the various parts of the body. So we will learn about those two divisions of the nervous system separately. Also, you know that there's some functions in the body that we have voluntary control over. So when you lift up your arm, it's because you intended to lift up your arm. You deliberately did that on purpose. So you have voluntary control over the muscles that did that. The muscles that did that are the skeletal muscles. So we have voluntary control over the skeletal muscles. By contrast, we don't have control over how fast food moves through our intestine, and that function is controlled by smooth muscles. Right? So the smooth muscles we do not have voluntary control over. We also, likewise, we don't have any control over the diameter, voluntary control over the diameter of our blood vessels. That happens automatically. Okay, so the nervous system is typically divided into two types of nerves that are controlling the different functions. The type of nerves that control muscles that we have voluntary control over, they are put into what's known as a division, and that division is called the somatic nervous system. The nerves that control the smooth muscles that we don't have any control over, we put that into a division called the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about that in detail later. So the autonomic nervous system refers to the nerves that control muscles and other body functions that we do not have any control over. Okay, so the nervous system controls the muscles, and the muscles, of course, control or pull different bones, right? And so that allows us to move. All right, now let's move on to the endocrine system. The endocrine system is responsible for producing molecules that are called hormones, and hormones kind of control the body in a slow, general sense. Right? So you know, for instance, that when we grow from being children into adults, our body goes through quite a few changes. Those changes are mediated and controlled by hormones, and hormones are produced by a bunch of organs that are referred to as the endocrine system. And you also know that if you feel scared, for instance, if somebody sneaks up behind you wearing a scary mask and scares you, that you will feel this feeling of fear, and that is caused by a hormone called epinephrine being released from the adrenal glands. And so that feeling is caused by hormones as well. So hormones can cause sort of in a slow, they don't control body movements or body changes as fast as the skeletal system and the nervous system do. Instead they secrete these complicated chemicals into the bloodstream, which circulate around the body and cause broad physical changes to the body. Okay, so that's the endocrine system. Cardiovascular system, I'm sure you know what that means. The word cardio refers to the heart, and then vascular refers to the blood vessels, the veins and the arteries. Right? So the heart circulates the blood around the body. Basically, any blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart to the body is referred to as an artery, and any blood vessel that carries blood from the body back to the heart is called a vein. That is the functional definition of a vein versus an artery. An artery carries blood away from the heart. A vein carries blood back to the heart. Generally, most of the time, the blood that is traveling back to the heart is oxygen depleted. So the oxygen has been used up and it's traveling back to the heart. It will go from the heart into the lungs to get fresh oxygen. So when blood is oxygen depleted, it has a slight blue color. And so in anatomy books, the veins, which are carrying the oxygen depleted blood, are colored blue. And the arteries that are carrying the oxygen enriched blood are colored red. And so you can see here on this diagram that a number of different veins and arteries are shown. The lymphatic system is also known as the immune system, right? And it is one of the most functionally important parts of the immune system are white blood cells, whose job it is to destroy foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses. The reason why we're taking this course by remote this year is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The immune system consists of the white blood cells that are meant to kill viruses. If you're lucky, the immune system will kill the virus before it kills you, and that's what the immune system is for. And the immune system is also known as the lymphatic system. And one of the reasons for that is because the lymphatic system includes a fluid that flows around your body inside a parallel network of little tiny tubes called lymphatic vessels. So I showed you in the previous slide that you have veins and arteries that carry blood around the body. There's another network of small vessels called lymphatic vessels that carry a fluid called lymph around the body, and they have to do with the immune system. They are part of the lymphatic system. Right, so the lymphatic system refers to the immune system, the white blood cells that are there to kill invaders, as well as the lymphatic ducts, the lymphatic vessels that carry lymph, a fluid called lymph. And those lymphatic vessels are punctuated, they are interrupted at various spots by little tiny organs that are referred to as lymph nodes. And those lymph nodes they're kind of like a police roadblock, where you have, if a highway is like, if a road is like a lymphatic vessel, you know that every now and then the police put up a roadblock and they shine a flashlight into each car and they ask if you've been drinking alcohol or something like that. They're looking for criminals. And the lymph nodes in the lymphatic system are kind of like police roadblocks. They stop this lymphatic fluid, and these lymph nodes are filled with white blood cells that are like the police, and they look inside and they say, are there any criminals in here? Are there any bacteria or viruses? or cancerous cells that are trying to get through this road. And that's what the lymph nodes are. And so there are many, many lymph nodes all over the body. Here's some lymph nodes under the armpit. Those are referred to as the axillary lymph nodes. And then there's another bunch of lymph nodes under your chin, which are referred to as the submandibular lymph nodes. And you notice that if you feel sick and you go to a doctor, the first thing they do is they massage and feel your submandibular lymph nodes, and they feel your axillary lymph nodes to see if they're swollen. And if they are, that's a sign that your body is trying to fight off some infection, because the lymph nodes are getting active and the white blood cells that are contained in the lymph nodes are dividing and trying to kill viruses or bacteria that are trying to invade your body. So we'll discuss the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system is actually quite complicated, the way the white blood cells work together to kill foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses. People have trouble studying how the lymphatic system works, how the immune system works, but like anything else in life, it's just a matter of practice. So if you put in the effort and you study the material over and over again, you will understand it. It's that simple. It's not beyond anybody's grasp. It's only a matter of putting in the effort and reviewing the material often enough. Okay, the respiratory system. Respiration, of course, means breathing. You'll see that we also use the term respiration when we talk about cells, individual cells generating generating chemical energy, ATP. But for now, on a large scale, on a macro scale, a large scale, the respiratory system includes the lungs as well as the trachea, and also the nasal passages, right? So the larynx, that lump in your throat, is called the larynx. At the bottom, at the base of the larynx, at the bottom of the larynx, you have a type of tissue called cricoid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage is the division between the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. So below the cricoid cartilage, you have the trachea and the lungs. That's the lower respiratory tract, and above that, you have the mouth and the nose, which are also considered to be part of the respiratory system. And so when somebody says to you that you have a lower respiratory tract infection, that means you're infected by bacteria or viruses below the cricoid cartilage down in the lungs, which is much more serious than if you have an upper respiratory tract infection. So remember, the upper respiratory tract consists of the mouth and the nose, which are in the head, right? And so that's what they mean when they say you have a head cold. A head cold is an upper respiratory tract infection, because it's mainly limited to the nose and the nasal passages, but sometimes a little bit of the cold, the effects can be felt in the trachea, or the trachea, commonly known as the windpipe, or the lungs. All right, the digestive system. This is how we digest food. The digestive system consists of the mouth, the esophagus, which takes food from the mouth to the stomach. Then we have the stomach. The stomach connects to the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. The second part of the small intestine is called the jejunum. The next part of the small intestine is called the ileum. The small intestine then connects to the large intestine at a structure called the cecum. The cecum then becomes the large intestine, or the colon. So when we go from here upwards, that's called the ascending colon. Then we go across this way, that's called the transverse colon. And then we go back down, that's called the descending colon. Then we reach this part of the colon that's kind of S-shaped, and that's called the sigmoidal colon. Sigmoid colon, sigmoid is a Greek word meaning S, the letter S. And then we have the rectum and the anus, where the food that we can't digest comes out. Right. And then we have some organs that we call accessory organs that are connected to the digestive system, which includes the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas, which is located behind the stomach. So those are all involved in eating, chewing up the food, sending it down to the stomach. The proteins will begin to be broken down in the stomach, and then the carbohydrates and the lipids and the nucleic acids will be broken down into smaller components in the intestine. They will be absorbed into our blood, and then we use those components for nutrition. The renal system is also sometimes referred to as the urinary system, right? Because it produces and gets rid of urine. It's also sometimes referred to as the excretory system because the urine is excreted. Excreted means to send it outside the body as a liquid. Okay, so the parts that comprise the renal system are two kidneys. We have a left and a right kidney. Those kidneys, their job is to filter the blood and remove a toxic chemical called urea. The kidneys then concentrate the urea in the center of the kidney, which is an area called the renal pelvis, and it then sends it down to the bladder through these two tubes which connect the kidneys to the bladder. Those tubes are urinary tubes. They connect to the urinary bladder. By the way, the technical term for the tubes is ureters, but so these tubes, the tubes that take the urine from the kidney to the bladder, are called the ureters. And then from the bladder, at a time that we choose, the urine is sent out through a tube called the urethra. It's called the urethra in both men and women, by the way. So the men and women have different reproductive organs that are in that area, but the urinary system is the same in both men and women, of course. Okay, where this area diverges is in the reproductive system. So women have they have a uterus which is supplied with eggs from two ovaries, and they have a vagina. And then the men have a penis and testicles. And the testicles, the purpose of the testicles is to produce sperms. The purpose of the ovaries and the women is to produce eggs. The technical term for the eggs is ova, O-V-A. And then the technical term for the sperm is spermatozoa. Both the eggs, the ova, and the spermatozoa are haploid. So haploid means that they have only one copy of each gene. Right? Humans are what's called diploid. Right? So humans have two copies of every gene inside every cell. The human genome, the term human genome, refers to all the genes that a human is supposed to have. And humans are diploid because inside every cell we have two complete copies of the human genome. When we make a new human, when a man and a woman get together to make a new human, we want to make a new set of those genes. And so the man only contributes one copy of each gene, and the woman only contributes one copy of each gene. And then we create a diploid human again. But the germ cells, as they're called, the eggs and the sperm, the germ cells are haploid. Right? And then whenever you have haploid germ cells coming together that are meant to come together and form a diploid organism, we refer to those haploid germ cells as gametes. Calling them gametes is something that you'll hear more commonly in a genetics course. If you ever take Biology 234 or any other genetics course, we discuss genetics in Biology 110 as well. The term gamete is used more than eggs and sperm. In an anatomy course, we call them eggs and sperm, but they are also known as gametes, those haploid cells that are put together in different combinations to make a new human being with a slightly different combination of genes. Okay, so that's the reproductive system. Okay, what's the difference between anatomy and physiology? Anatomy means learning the names and locations of all the body parts, whereas physiology means learning what they do and how they work together to sustain life. All right, some other new words for you. Pathology. So again, the word logi means the same thing. It means the study of. And the word pathos is an ancient Greek word that means suffering, to suffer. So pathology is a branch of medicine which is the study of things that make you suffer. So the study of things that make you sick is called pathology. Right? And so one of the things that I think makes it easier to learn about anatomy and physiology is so anatomy and physiology, we're learning how the human body works. But if we study a little bit of pathology, which is the study of how the human body breaks down, it's the study of things that can go wrong with it, we can also learn about anatomy and physiology that way. So a fair amount of this course is devoted to pathology as well as anatomy and physiology. So we'll be studying a lot of illnesses and sicknesses and conditions where the body breaks down and you get sick. Pathology is a branch of medicine. Medicine is actually the study of how to fix the things that break down. Right? So pathology is actually an integral part of medicine. Pathology is one of the subdisciplines of medicine, in fact. So you might have heard that there are cardiologists. A cardiologist is a medical doctor that studies the heart or the vascular system. Uh, there are hematologists. A hematologist is a medical doctor that studies the blood. The word hemo or hemato refers to the formation of blood. And a pathologist is a medical doctor that identifies the causes of illnesses. Um, Cardiologists have patients, pathologists generally don't. Or if a pathologist does have a patient, the patient is usually dead, because a pathologist, one of the jobs that a pathologist does is to figure out what caused somebody to die, right? So you've probably seen coroners and people like that who cut up dead bodies and say this person died of a heart attack and this person died of a brain aneurysm and so on. That's a pathologist who does that. But that's only one of the jobs that a pathologist might have. But anyway, just to let you know, we will study a certain amount of pathology in this course because I think you can learn a lot about how the body works by studying what happens when it breaks down. All right, now I want to introduce you to another concept in physiology called homeostasis. Okay? There are certain parameters of the body, like the body temperature, the blood pressure, the pulse or the heart rate, the level of glucose in the blood sugar levels, the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood versus the amount of oxygen in the blood. All of those things are kept within a certain range. Right? So you already know that the normal temperature for the human body is 37. Right? And so if the body goes above 37 in temperature or below 37, the body starts doing things to bring the temperature back to 37, and that is an example of homeostasis. So homeostasis is the control of certain body functions to within a certain range. Okay, so when something happens to take one of these parameters out of the normal range, that is referred to as a stimulus. Referred to as a stimulus. Something happens to change the body temperature from 37, for example. Negative feedback is where the body responds to the stimulus by doing things that bring the body back to the normal range. So if the body temperature goes up, we would call that a stimulus, and then if we sweat to bring it back down to 37, that would be considered negative feedback. That would be called negative feedback. Positive feedback is where there's a deviation and the body does something to increase the deviation from the normal range. To increase the deviation from the normal range. So for instance, if your body temperature goes up a little bit because you're sick, there's a certain cascade or a certain combination of hormones that are produced to make your entire body feel hotter than it should be, and that's called a fever. There are certain types of blood cells that destroy the invaders like viruses and bacteria that work better at a high temperature. So a fever is actually, to some extent, is useful. If for instance, that the blood has a certain amount of glucose, a certain concentration of glucose that is normal, if the amount of glucose goes down, that would be a stimulus. And if you want to bring the amount of glucose in the blood back up, you generally mobilize glucose from the liver and from the muscles where it is stored. So that's another example of negative feedback, rather. There aren't actually that many examples of positive feedback. I gave you one example, which is creating a fever when you get sick. Another example is during childbirth. So when a woman is giving birth to a baby, the baby's head pushes against the cervix, which is the way out, basically. It's the way to get out of the vagina. During birth, we rename the vagina the birth canal. So we take the cervix and the vagina together and call that the birth canal. So when a woman is giving birth, the baby's head bumps into the cervix and opens it a little bit. Right? So that would be a stimulus. The body responds by opening it even further to let the baby out. So during childbirth, that is the other main example of positive feedback to homeostasis. Right, so there are lots of examples of negative feedback for homeostasis, ways that we bring the body temperature into the normal range, ways that we bring the blood pressure into the normal range, and so on. There are only a couple of examples of positive feedback, and one of them is childbirth, the other one is creating a fever when we get an infection. Okay, so these are the things that are controlled homeostatically. These are the parameters that are controlled. Generally, when we talk about homeostasis, we're talking about the control of these things and keeping them all within a certain range. All right, so before we move on to lecture number 2, let's just ask a couple of practice questions, and then you can, if you get them all right and you think you understand this part, you can proceed to the next lecture. Okay, so this is what we talked about. Let's look at some practice questions. Okay, so question number 1, which statement is true? Atoms are made of molecules, or are molecules made of atoms? Question number 2, what are the 4 types of macromolecules? Question number 3, sugars are members of which of those 4 classes of macromolecules? Do you remember? You can stop the tape, or you can stop the recording and pause for a minute while you have to think if you want to. Okay, so oils, like vegetable oils, are members of which class of macromolecules? Okay, genes encode which class of macromolecules? Which of the 4 classes of macromolecules do genes actually make? And name 2 things that are regulated by homeostasis. Name 2 parameters of the body that are regulated homeostatically. Okay, if you want to stop here and resume, I'll give you the answer. Okay, so the answers to these questions. First of all, molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are not made of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. The 4 types of macromolecules are proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. The sugars are classified as carbohydrates, or carbohydrates are commonly called sugars, but it's actually a bit of a misnomer. And oils, fats and oils, are members of the lipids, the class of macromolecules called lipids. Genes build proteins, and then the proteins build the other macromolecules. So the proteins catalyze. Some of the proteins are things called enzymes, which mediate chemical reactions, and those specific chemical reactions are used to create carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. And then name any 2 things that are regulated homeostatically. So that would be body temperature, blood pressure, blood glucose levels, the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, the pulse, the heart rate. All of those things are controlled homeostatically. Okay, let's look at some other questions. Let's see if you know the organ systems. Okay, so human hair is part of which organ system? Question 2, hormones are produced by which organ system? Question 3, the lungs are part of which organ system? Question 4, which organ system do the kidneys belong to? Question 5, which organ system does the stomach belong to? And question 6, which organ system does the heart belong to? Okay, you ready for the answers? Okay, the hair is part of the integument. The skin, the fingernails, the toenails, and the hair are all part of the integument. So, as hard as it is to believe, the skin, this whole mass of epithelial tissue that surrounds the outside of the body, the skin is considered to be an organ. We don't normally think of the skin as an organ, but that's what we call it. That's how we've classified it. All right, so hormones are produced by the endocrine system. Examples of endocrine organs would be the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands on the kidneys. We'll talk about all of those when we get to it, when we get to that organ system. The lungs are part of the respiratory system, along with the trachea, the bronchial tubes, the nasal passages. That's all part of the respiratory system. The kidneys are part of the renal system. In fact, the word renal refers to the kidneys, and so you'll see that when we study the renal system, we're referring to the function of the kidneys and a lot of other things that are associated with the kidneys. The stomach, of course, is part of the digestive system. I mentioned that the liver is sometimes connected to the digestive system, but the liver is actually a fascinating organ. It has many different functions, and so the liver is actually classified as being part of several different systems, several different organ systems, but the liver actually does a lot of really interesting things. And the word that you used to describe the liver or the liver system or liver cells is hepato. So a hepatocyte is a liver cell. Right? So there's a vein called the hepatic portal vein, which leads a vein that leads into the liver, the hepatic portal vein. So we'll learn about that. Okay, so the heart, of course, is a member of the cardiovascular system. Okay, you can go on to lecture part 2 now.